So, this week, we are starting the new sermon series on music. We're doing this because, music has been a very important part of my life. And I actually thought years ago, this would make a great sermon series. Just look at music, look at songs, and see the lessons, and even sometimes sermons already in songs. Because some of these songs are just so amazing, they basically have sermons built in that sometimes you don't stop and think about. So this month and next month, we're going to stop and look at a song every week and see what lessons are actually in that song that maybe we have missed. And this week, we're going to start with a classic. I'm sure you already know it and heard about it. It's a song called Amazing Grace. But music has been very important in my life. It started when I was younger. I still remember a time in church. I had to be upper elementary, maybe junior high age, early teenagers, somewhere in there. We had a guest speaker that week. And I just remember one part of his sermon. Because he said, you make sure you don't sing a lie. Because sometimes we sing these songs, we say things, and maybe we don't really willing to do these things. The example he used was, I surrender all. If you sing I surrender, are you really willing to surrender all to Jesus? Everything. So that was his sermon. A side note here, this sermon I heard when I was like an early teen, I still remember and still affects me today. It adds an extra layer of pressure on me because, there are teenagers in the room here today. I could say something they remember forever, and I don't want to mess them up. So, extra pressure and fear on my life. But, because of that sermon, I put a lot of emphasis on the lyrics of songs, the message of that song. It's been a great, and so every song I listen to, I think about what it says. It drives my wife crazy sometimes. But, the lyrics are very important. All the song, I like the music, the band, but, that has to have a good lyric and a good message because, I pay attention to that a lot. And so it's had a great influence on my life. So that's why we're doing this sermon series. And I want to start off by giving a little fun facts about the song Amazing Grace. It was written by a guy named John Newton. He was an Anglican priest in England, and he wrote the song for a sermon illustration on his New Year's Day sermon in 1773. This song is over 250 years old. And we have no clue when he wrote it if there was music with it or not. The music we have used with it, that was added on like a couple decades later. So we don't know what, if any music, could have been a chant, it could have been more of a poem, we don't really know. But anyways, it started 1773, New Year's Day. Since then, it has grown in popularity just a little bit. I came across one estimate that Amazing Grace is performed 10 million times worldwide every year. It is the most popular English song ever. And it really got its popularity during the Second Great Awakening here in America. In case you're not aware, the Second Great Awakening is a religious revival that happened in America very, very early in the 19th century. It spread across America, a revival. Actually, at that point in time, Christianity was almost dead in America. Everybody's with their own lives and not the church, until this revival came around. And then during that revival, Amazing Grace became hugely popular. You know what else came out of the Second Great Awakening? We did. This denomination is also a product of the Second Great Awakening. So we have something a little in common with the song. It's like a brother to us. We all came from the same place. I found that interesting, at least. You may not, but I do enjoy history, so I did find that fascinating. Okay, but now I want to look at the history of John Newton. The influences in his life that caused him to write this song. You may know bits and pieces of it, and I'm going to hit some of the highlights, because he had a rough life that led to the writing of the song Amazing Grace. He was born into a Christian family. His mother even wanted him to be a clergyman. He wanted him to go into the church. But she died when he was 6 years old. So that changed the course of his life a lot. When he was 11, he became apprentice on the ship his dad was working on. So he became a sailor at an early age. Well, when he became an adult, he actually turned his back on his faith. Not only did he turn his back on his faith, he was more anti-religious. He mocked and criticized those people who still believed in God. He thought they were fools and criticized them. Also, as an adult, he ended up getting a job on a slave ship. He was on a ship transferring slaves from Africa to England. He did that for quite a few years. And in that time, he was living a life full of sin. Any sin imaginable, he was engaged in it. He earned this reputation as somebody who was crude, unruly, and very profane. If the term swearing like a sailor didn't start with him, it very easily could have. That was his reputation. That's who he was. So that was the life of sin he was living on aboard these slave ships, going back and forth from Africa to England. Until one night, something happened that started changing his life. Because he was in the boat and a storm came up. One night, this big storm came up. Waves were coming over the ship, one of those storms that could easily have sunk their ship. Well, as they were fighting the storm, John Newton saw somebody on the ship get swept overboard. Wave took him overboard, and he realized he was just standing where that man was a moment earlier. He was that close to death. But, they fought this storm all night long. They were bailing water, tying things down to the ship. And eventually, they even tied themselves to the ship. And after John Newton tied himself to the ship, something came out of his mouth. It was one of those times where you speak without thinking. Now, have you ever had those times words are coming out of your mouth and you don't know where they're coming from? That's what happened to him. And what he said greatly affected him. So here's what he said. It'll be up here on the screen because it's important, and it's on the bulletin insert if you care to fill those things out. This is what he said after he tied himself to the ship. "If this will not do, then Lord, have mercy upon us." It was that time when they had done all they know how to do. And so now it's up to God whether they will live or die. But you realize this is a man who had turned his back on God, had criticized those who worshiped God, who was actively involved in any sin possible, no religious at all. But in this moment, these words, crying out for mercy from God, came out of his mouth. It was very shocking to him, surprising to him that these things would even come out of him. And that's what started him to think. So, of course, they survived the storm. And he continued in the slave trade business for several years after that. But during the time, he kept thinking back to that night and those words that he said. And he started wondering, is he really worth God's mercy? With all he has done, all the sins he has committed, is he worth God's mercy? And is there any way he is redeemable? These thoughts, just recurring things. And he started to clean his act up a bit. But eventually, he left the slave trade business, not for any moral reasons, but actually for health reasons. He was no longer able to be a sailor, so he left the slave trade business. And eventually, he did turn his life around. Eventually, he did give his heart to God and experience this amazing grace and go into the church and become a clergyman. And even by the end of his life, he was a very outspoken abolitionist. He tried to end the slave trade business he was involved in for so many years. So that is a short version of John Newton's life. And as I was going through this, looking at this, I realized it had some similarities to a parable Jesus told. Another parable I'm sure you've all heard many times. The parable of the prodigal son. And that is found in Luke chapter 11, Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. I am not going to read you that today. Instead, I'm just going to tell you the story. So this is the gospel according to Jesse. Take that for what it's worth. But that's why I wrote down the scripture on your handout there so you can go home, you can read it and see how accurate I was and let me know if any mistakes I made, because I'm sure there are going to be some of them. But this is my telling the story, maybe a few embellishments in there. The story starts with the younger of two sons going to talk to his father. And he says, "Dad, I want my inheritance now. Give me my money I will get when you die now." Now, you got to realize, especially at that time in that culture, he was basically saying, "Dad, I don't need you. I don't want you. All I want is your money. And I don't need anything else from you." It's a very insulting thing to say to your father. But you know what? This father actually gave his son the money. He said, "Here, son, here's your inheritance." And not surprisingly, he took the money and he ran off and left. And he lived a life of sin with wild parties, crazy times, engaging in any sin imaginable, until, predictably, he ran out of money. Then he ran out of friends. So he had to do something to survive. So he got a job, the only job he could find, which was to feed pigs. Now you also have to remember, in this time, pigs were unclean animals. It was a very bad thing for a Jewish man to take care of pigs, because they were unclean. They shouldn't eat them, they shouldn't be around them, shouldn't take care of them. It was a bad thing. But that was the only job he could find. Not only was it the only job he could find, it was a job that didn't pay hardly anything. He couldn't even afford to feed himself. He found himself looking at this food he was giving the pigs and wishing he could eat some of that food. And you know, pig food is not that good. Not nearly as good as those lemon shake-ups we had yesterday. Not nearly like that. But anyway, so the prodigal son, he was looking for food, he was craving this food. And then he had a thought. He realized, you know, my father has servants. And those servants, they have food to eat. They have much better places to stay than I have. So he realized, yeah, I could go back and maybe I could beg my father to take me on as a servant. Because, you know, I'm not deserving to be a son anymore. With the choices I made, the things that I did, I don't deserve to be a son anymore. But maybe, just maybe, I can talk him into allowing me to be a servant. So he decided he would do that. So he got up, he started going back home. And now you can imagine, he's on his way home to talk to his father. Imagine how horrible this conversation is going to be. It's going to be an unpleasant conversation. So he is planning, he is preparing this speech he was going to give. How he was going to beg his father forgiveness, ask for mercy, and just beg and plead to be a servant, you know. So it was a long walk. He had lots of time to plan and prepare the speech he was going to give his father. But now his father, on the other hand, every day his father went out of his house and he looked down that road, hoping to see his son coming back home. Every day he went out and he looked, day after day, until it finally happened. That day he went out, he looked down the road, he saw his son coming home. He was overjoyed. He dropped everything and he ran to his son. And when he got to his son started to try to give this speech he prepared. But his father grabbed him, hugged him close, kissed him, started weeping tears of joy. He was so happy his son had come home. That story and John Newton's story has several similarities. You know, they both grew up in Christian homes. They both ran away from home and lived lives of sin. Then they both experienced problems and trials in their lives, a result of their sins, which caused them to go back home to their fathers. And when they did, they experienced this amazing grace. Now, in the story of the prodigal son, the older son came and asked him questions and concerns. The father's response to his son is probably a good motivation for this song of Amazing Grace. There's some similars in the song too. So let's look at what the father said to his son, said to his oldest son about his younger son. That is in Luke chapter 15, verse 24. Let's see what the father said about his son after he returned. He said, "For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." He was lost and is found. That is how John Newton felt when he gave up his life of sin and accepted God's grace. Lost and then found. So that was John Newton's story, and that was the prodigal son story. So, question for you guys, I don't expect answers. How much of those stories have similarities to your stories? I mean, have there been times where you have gone into a life of sin? Maybe you didn't turn your back on God completely. Maybe you didn't renounce your faith. But you allowed this sin to come into your life and pull you away from God, lead you down the wrong path. And the sin caused you problems in your life, brought you to hard times. But then when you repented of that sin and you came back to God, you found this grace and forgiveness in our God. Made you realize that you were blind and you were lost. But we come back to God, you were found. So that is John Newton's story. It influenced him in writing the song. So we're going to play this song real fast. It's a song you know. It's a song you hear. I'm going to encourage you not to sing it. I know that's hard. But instead, pull out this insert in your bulletin and look at the words. Read the words. See his history. See his struggle. See the things that motivated these lyrics. The things he went through that he wanted to share so that we can learn from his struggles. We can learn from the things he went through. So we're going to play it, follow along, and just see if you can see his struggles and what lessons you can learn from John Newton's life in this song. Let's go ahead and play it.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fear relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Twas grace that led me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. Oh, he will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to
of those songs, no matter how many times you heard it, how well you know it, when you stop and you think about it and you really listen to it, it still gets you. And I've listened to it, 100 times this week getting ready. Every time, though, it is an amazing song. Okay, but for the rest of the sermon, I'm going to look at some key words and phrases in that song so we can see what lessons John Newton is trying to teach us through his song. The first one I'll look at is the word wretch. That's how he described himself in the beginning. Amazing grace, how sweet the song that saved a wretch like me. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't know exactly what wretch meant. I had to go look that up. It's not a word I commonly use. So I Googled it, and this is what Google told me. This here is the definition of wretch: an unfortunate or unhappy person. So that's how John Newton described himself when he was living a life of sin. Okay, that is the family-friendly version of how John Newton would describe himself in his life. I'm sure he had much more colorful words he could have used to describe himself that he probably preferred to use, but were not appropriate in a church service. So he simplified it and said, those times when I was living these lives of sin, doing whatever I wanted to do, I was really a wretch. I was an unhappy person. Even though I did what I pleased, didn't worry about what God said, I was really still an unhappy person. So he's asking us to ask ourselves, have there been times in our lives where we would call ourselves a wretch? Have there been times in your life where you have been an unhappy person? Especially if it was because of your own sins or even somebody else's sins that can make you be an unhappy person. Those times in our lives when we have struggles, we have pains, we have problems, that we could call ourselves a wretch because of sins. I'm sure we've all been there, we've all had those times that we were a wretch. And that's how John Newton starts this. That's our starting point. Without God, we are a wretch. That's where we start with. And he goes on from that. The next verse he goes to, it's about fear. And he says two seemingly contradicting things about fear. Because it says first, grace taught him taught his heart to fear. Then he said grace relieves his fear. And those seem very contradictory. How can grace, teach you to fear and relieve you of fear at the same time? That seems very odd and contradictory. So I did some thinking, I did some looking up, and this is what I came up with. So if we're talking about grace, we're talking about this amazing grace. Essentially what grace is God's forgiveness. God's forgiveness we do not deserve and we cannot earn. So when we're thinking about grace, we can think about what happens if we didn't have God's grace. If we didn't have God's forgiveness, where would that leave us? What would happen if we didn't have it? Well, let's look at what Paul said about that. How Paul described those who didn't have God's grace. We're going to look at Romans chapter 1, verse 18. And see what he describes, what happens to those people who do not have God's amazing grace. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. It says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godless and wickedness of people, who suppress the truth by their wickedness." The wrath of God is coming on these people. If you don't have God's grace, you are facing God's wrath. Because God's amazing grace, God's mercy, it teaches us that God has justice and his wrath. So in order to really appreciate God's amazing grace, we first have to understand God's justice and his wrath. Because without that mercy, without that grace, we have to face his wrath. And now if that doesn't teach you to fear, nothing will. I mean, imagine facing the wrath of an all-powerful being. You don't want to be on his bad side. If that should teach you to fear, I'm assuming that is what John Newton's talking about, how grace taught him to fear. Because he did not have that fear of God when he was living his sinful life. But that night, in that storm, he started to understand the wrath of God. And it started to teach his heart to fear. But then he went on. This amazing grace didn't only teach him to fear, it also relieved his fears. Because when we realize God's grace, what it is, because we realize God's grace, it forgives our sins. And we're no longer facing God's wrath, but God is now on our side. Let's look what Paul had to say about this also. We'll look at, again, Romans chapter 8, verses 31. What it says about us when we have God on our side. Romans chapter 8, verse 31. What then shall we say in response to these things? And he's referring to things of the problems in this world. If you read before that, I cut that out. So what do we say in response to these things, these struggles, these problems in this world? This is Paul's answer. If God is for us, who can be against us? If God is on our side, if God is on our team, who can we fear? What do you really have to fear? I mean, you can try to answer that question. Well, I can fear my boss. I can fear disease. I can fear my neighbor. I can fear my relatives. You can fear all things you could fear. But if God is on your side, this all-powerful God who can do anything is on your side, what really do you have to fear? It makes our fears kind of irrational. Because it's like, if you were in the NBA in the 90s and you had a Michael Jordan on your team and you were playing a high school team, you had zero fear of losing because, you could sit mid-court and let Jordan do all the work and you were fine. When we face our fears, we have something better than Michael Jordan on our team. We have God on our team. This amazing grace teaches us we don't need to fear because God has switched sides. We are no longer enemies. Actually, we have switched sides. We are no longer an enemy of God where we need to fear his wrath. No, now God is on our side where we don't need to fear anything. That is truly how amazing this grace is. Well, I'm going to lump the last 3 verses of Amazing Grace together with one theme, one concept. I'm summarizing it in just one word, and that is home. He is talking about home. Because we see in that 3rd verse, he talks about the problems he had in this life, the dangers, toils, and snares that he has come through, he had survived. It says grace had brought him through that. But more importantly, that verse ends with, and grace will lead me home. Yes, it brought him home to his family in this life, yes. But ultimately, it will lead him home to God. Because that next verse is all about how God helps him in this life, brings him home now in this life. That he has promised good to us, that our hopes are secure in him, that he is our shield as long as this life endures. We have a home in him in this life. Grace brings us to that home. But more importantly is where he ends. This grace, this amazing grace, it brings us home to be with God forever. Kind of like that prodigal son, when he makes it home to his father. He makes it home to God. The joyous celebration, the rejoicing that there is, that is like when we make it home. I love how John Newton describes this, very simply, very poetically. Because he says when we've been there 10,000 years, then he describes heaven as bright, shining as the sun. I can't help but contrast that vision of heaven he has, bright, shining as the sun, to that night he had in the ship, in the storm, where everything was dark and bleak. So we have the contrast as heaven, bright, shining as the sun, to his time when he feared, was the deepest part of his sin in that storm. Heaven is completely different than that. It is bright, shining like the sun. But anyways, he goes on to say, when we've been there 10,000 years. Okay, first of all, 10,000, can we even imagine 10,000 years? I mean, 10,000 years, that's like about as long as the recorded history of humanity. I mean, that is a very long time we have a hard time comprehending. But when we've been there 10,000 years, he says, we have no less days to sing God's praise than when we first began. I imagine he's describing heaven like this. It's like that 10,000 years is a drop in a bucket. And that bucket has a hole in it. So you keep putting these years in this bucket, but the bucket never fills because it just leaks back out. That's what heaven is. We have eternity in heaven with God that's bright, shining like the sun. It's not like that terrible, horrible storm he was in. It's completely opposite. For him, that's how he described heaven. A total change to what he had been, to what he'd become. And it was all because of God's amazing grace. So, what lessons is John Newton trying to teach us from his song? I summarized it down to three. These are the three things I want you to remember from my sermon today. Three things remember from John Newton's sermon in song form to remember. So we're doing three, not just one, a little stronger, more of a challenge this week. But the first thing we should remember is God's amazing grace is so amazing because it offers forgiveness for all that we have done wrong. All we have done wrong. And for John Newton, that was quite the statement. For the prodigal son, that would be quite the statement. For us, you know how much you've done wrong. I know how much I've done wrong, how much I need his forgiveness. And he forgives it all because of his amazing grace. Well, the second thing, God's grace is amazing because, number two, it puts God on our side so we don't need to fear. I mean, if you were in any sport, what would you do to get the biggest, strongest person on your team? Pretend you're back in school at PE, you're picking teams. What would you do to get the best person on your team? You know what? God is on our team, and he offers a way to get us on his team. His amazing grace puts God on our team. How much more amazing could that grace be? It's amazing. I don't even think that's the best part of it. The third one here. God's grace is amazing because it leads us home. I mean, if that's not the best part of this life, making it to home with God in heaven, I don't know what is. Because, all kinds of things happen in this life where we should be home with God in this life. And that is amazing. That alone itself says God's grace is so amazing. But God's grace leads us to God's home. God's not coming to our home no more. No. We go to his home. And his home is much better than our home. This amazing grace leads us to God's home for eternity. This is truly amazing. Worthy of this song that has become so popular. So today, if by chance you haven't accepted God's grace, or maybe you know somebody who needs God's grace, they've probably heard this song. You can go explain this significance, because this song is so popular. They have heard it. They know it. You can use this song to let them know about how truly amazing God's grace is.